Welcome, launch team, Thinning the Veil launch team, to this live Q&A with me and with prominent New Testament scholar Scot McKnight. Honestly, Scott, I was looking back at my calendar this morning, thinking of the first time we shared a meal. It was actually in 2012 when you were down here in Joplin, Missouri. So it's
Yeah,
been a minute
yeah.
since we've shared that space. But I do want to start off by just saying thank you for taking time out to have this conversation. For those of you, I'm sure most of you are already aware, but Scott has written quite a little bit, from commentaries to books to even one of his most recent 2023 or 2023. That's right, Revelation for the Rest of Us, which is a fantastic book on the Book of Revelation. And Scott was at for many years at Northern Seminary, but now he's down at Houston Theological Seminary. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
But you still are
And
living in Chicago.
yeah, and also I teach at Westminster Theological Center in England for Lucy Pepiot and Ben Blackwell. And
Oh,
my first class starts this September I'll be teaching in Nottingham, England, where I did my PhD.
I was gonna ask if that was kind of like a return back to an alma
It is.
mater.
It
Yeah,
really
that's
is.
right.
Full circle.
Now, you studied under James Dunn,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Goodness. Well, I studied under Helen Bond, who had a close
Oh, yeah.
relationship with, in
Jimmy.
her words, Jimmy Dunn. But I
Jimmy.
don't
That's
really
right.
feel comfortable calling him that. But
Well, that's what he wanted. He insisted that I call him Jimmy. When he
okay,
came to our house when we first got to England, he came right after we arrived.
no
He says,
kidding.
"Call me Jimmy." I said, "Okay."
Well, it sounds like he had the same grace toward you as I feel like that you've had towards me. For whatever
Thank you.
reason, I just you have been an incredible what's the word, champion for me in ways that I don't understand how I deserve, or but I'm very grateful. And so I'm very excited that the launch team gets to experience this as well. I am supposed to let everybody know that you can submit questions throughout the hour, them in, and then one of our wonderful people from IVP will pass those along to us, and hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. But I really want to kind of start off. I'm gonna. Is it okay if I start off by asking you a question, Scott? Is that all right?
Oh, well, that's not on the list, but that's okay.
Well, I was going back through Revelation for the Rest of Us, and you have this beautiful. I call it beautiful because I was trying to picture young Scot McKnight, converting in 1972, and diving right into the deep end with the Book of Revelation. So,
Yeah.
I guess my initial question is just, the Book of Revelation and the beginning of your journey. Like, how did that all come to be?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Shane, and I'm honored to be with you and proud of this new book of yours. And I was reading this morning again the blurbs. You have some really nice blurbs, endorsements
Mhm.
from some really good people. So very well done. I grew up in dispensationalism. When I was a paper boy, the first thing my parents wanted me to buy with my money was a Schofield Bible, which I
Okay.
still have, although most of the time I can't find it. I don't even know where it is anymore. It's in another room. But we were dispensational, and when you grow up with this, you just don't know there's any other view, and
Mhm.
no one was discussing Revelation in my world that I would have been exposed to any other reading of it, and I probably wouldn't have been open to it anyway. Um,
Right.
and so when I had a transformative conversion experience between my junior and senior years at a church camp in Muscatine, Iowa. When I came back, I began reading the Bible from cover to cover, and I read it in about 9 or 10 months,
Hmm.
King James Version only.
Okay.
And I read a few books, but then I got into the book of Revelation because at our local Christian bookstore, there was a copy of a book uh, called Guide to Survival
Okay.
have you heard of this?
Yes, I have actually.
Okay,
I may
by
have a copy somewhere.
Salem. I don't have my copy.
Okay.
Salem Kurban. And
Yeah.
I never did read his bigger book called 666,
Hmm.
but it was sort of a precursor to Hal Lindsey's late
Mhm.
great Planet Earth. And I've heard funky stories about the relationship of the two books.
Hmm.
But so I read this book and it was just overwhelmingly convincing because I didn't have any other ideas about the book of Revelation.
Sure.
And then when I was in college at a Christian book college, it's now called Cornerstone University,
Hmm.
which is not what it was at the time. And I'll drop the conversation at that point without getting into what's going on there now.
Sure.
But there was a lot of discussions about Revelation going
Hmm.
on among college students, theological friends of mine, and I took a course, or I began reading
Hmm.
stuff on Revelation. Bob Gundry's The Church in the
Hmm.
Tribulation was
Hmm.
published, and I read that book so carefully, looking up every reference, checking out everything, and I became convinced of a post-trib rapture.
Post-trib.
Post-trib rapture,
Okay.
and at that point, my college pastor called me a liberal. Now he
Because you're
liked
a
me
post-trib?
because I was post-trib, I mean, I was departing from the truth. And then I began to read a little bit, but I honestly, by the time I think I was a junior, I may have been a senior. I tried to take a course on eschatology in
Hmm.
the Bible department,
Hmm.
theology. And the professor said to me, I won't permit you in class, but we can meet 2 or 3 times during the semester
Okay.
to discuss this because basically he said, you know too much about this to be in a classroom with people who don't know anything. And I probably would
Oh
have
no.
carried on a conversation with him every day.
Hmm.
But at any rate, um, I got so disaffected
Hmm.
with Revelation because I just found it to be um, cliquish, and it
Hmm.
became uh, who can come up with the most sensational reading and how this is going to work out.
Yeah.
And at that time, I was beginning to understand apocalyptic literature.
Hmm.
So I basically put it away, went to seminary. Nobody talked about it where I was in the classes that I took. And then in my PhD, I read through all the Old Testament Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha.
Hmm.
So I read R.H. Charles' 2 volumes,
Oh yeah.
big old heavy things.
Oh yeah.
And I checked them out from the University of Nottingham Library. And I said to myself, this this is the more correct approach. And I put it
Hmm.
away. Other than when would come up in classes, I just would try to baptize Revelation in apocalyptic thinking. So
Ah.
that's sort of, but I'm going to
Yeah.
ask you a question,
Sure,
and
fire away.
and that is, um, other than Hal Lindsey, what
Hmm.
led you to your interest in writing about the Book of Revelation? I
Yeah.
don't know if your church tradition
Uh-uh.
is as dispensational as mine was. I mean, we were Dallas and Bob Jones people.
Yeah,
So,
my tradition would be see, I find these two extremes typically whenever I talk on Revelation, the obsessed with the book or the people that ignore it. And
yeah,
so my tradition, the pages of the book of Revelation were the most crisp in our Bible. We just didn't really touch it, but we knew it was scary. And so,
yeah, yeah.
as it was actually, I was a junior in high school, and I was coming home late from like from a friend's house, like late for curfew, and I came up over a hill and I saw a blood red moon, I mean, I about swerved off the road. I'm like, oh no, the world's ending, and so the first time I read Revelation was that night at like 1:30 in the morning. I pulled it off and read it from Revelation 1 to 22, and was scared out of my mind.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and then um, and then it was my sophomore year at Ozark Christian College where I teach now, where it was supposed to be a senior level class, but I begged to get in. I was like, I have too many questions. I'm too curious. And it was there where I actually started to fall in love with the book of Revelation and to deal with a lot of the I don't know how to say it diplomatically, but a lot of the illusion that's around it, a lot of the garbage that's kind of stacked up on it. Which, I mean, I saw this at the beginning of Revelation for the rest of us, and I felt it too when I was writing. You almost have to feel like you have to clear the ground before you can say anything about this book because there's so much that is assumed, and there's so much that is downloaded into those. But then I actually went on and did my PhD on the Book of Revelation at Edinburgh under Helen Bond, and um, but this is really the book I've been waiting to write for the last
Mhm.
decade, and that's to
Well,
bring it back more.
when I wrote with Cody Matchett, Revelation for the Rest of Us, I went through your dissertation.
Oh,
I
did you?
mean,
Okay.
I did, you can't the kind of book that I wrote or we wrote,
Hmm.
uh, you can't interact with everybody about everything.
No.
There are rabbit trails
Yeah,
everywhere in the Book of Revelation,
indeed.
and you managed them very well, I think, in
Hmm.
thinning the veil. Um, you know, where I what I find, and you probably find the same thing, is that people think they know what this book is about.
Yeah.
Those who have been trained to think dispensationally. And I once
Hmm.
told an audience at Wheaton College that the most effective evangelical theological system in the world is
Hmm.
dispensationalism.
Yeah.
I mean, it people everywhere think like
Hmm.
this. I mean, you can go to a Presbyterian church or a Methodist church
Yep.
or a mainline church, Catholic churches, and people read the book of Revelation the way Hal Lindsey taught them.
Yeah. Well, I
Whether
mean,
they read, they read Tim LaHaye and Jerry. What's Jerry's?
Jerry Jenkins. Yeah.
Jerry Jenkins. My
Yeah.
son and his son played baseball against one another in high school. We won every time. Um, but they those books were
Mhm.
convinced people of how to
Yep.
think about Revelation, how to think about the future,
Hmm.
and so I'm wondering who you had in mind.
Hmm.
I can tell you that I had in mind
Hmm.
those who are disaffected by dispensationalism when
Yeah.
we wrote that book.
Yeah.
Who did you have in mind when you were writing this book?
Yeah. And I totally agree with you. I think that the fear is good marketing. And that's what I've always understood with the Left Behind series hook. Whenever you can, if you get people afraid, you can push them in any direction. And really the Left Behind dispensational perspective is wrapped around fear, and especially fear centered on pain. And yet, the thing that I have found over the years is that the prediction model leads to a different type of fear. Not a fear so much of pain, but a fear of almost like of abandonment or confusion as to they
Mhm,
thought they pieced together God's map, and
mhm,
then it falls apart. And there's only so many times you can reconfigure the jigsaw puzzle before you even start to question whether or not this is faith is right at all. As a matter of fact, way I've said it before is, at a certain point, we get the second coming with our predictions wrong so often, people start to question whether or not we have the first coming right. Uh, and it was those people that I had in mind, the ones that are deeply in love with Jesus, and yet this book is almost more of a thorn in the side than it is a blessing. And that's
mhm,
why I was grateful that some of the banners that IVP put out about this is ideas. My heart was to turn Revelation into a blessing for the church instead of a burden, which it seems
mhm.
like it has been for quite a while.
Shane, in teaching, I've been teaching 41 years.
Mm.
Um, a lot of people don't want to look at the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
And when I taught the first class I ever taught just on the book of Revelation, I had students ask me why I was doing this.
No
And,
kidding.
and, and they were like, why would you even bring this book up?
Wow.
Because it was a book that scared them.
Hmm.
They got it in junior high or high school with some kind of videos,
Hmm.
you've been left behind. Wish we'd all been ready, Larry. No.
Rich, right? That song, DC Talk.
And I don't know DC talk.
They
Um,
redid it.
okay, but they were just afraid of it. And I said, I want you to give it a chance because I think this book does something completely different than that.
Yeah.
Um, I want to go off script here. I want
Hmm.
you to tell me whether Revelation 12, the story
Uh-huh.
of the woman,
Hmm.
is the whole book.
Huh. Is the whole book. Okay. Yeah, I Revelation 12 at least grabs the heart of the book.
Yeah.
In particular, so even part of the title of thinning the veil came from reflection on Revelation 12, which is, I think,
Hmm.
exactly what's happening. Uh,
Hmm.
it's the most tranquil moment of our liturgical calendar, of our Christian, this silent night, holy night. Jesus is born. You have
Hmm.
this Mary-like figure, which I think can be the image itself can emanate into different directions, but on some level, it is Mary birthing, Revelation 12:5, birthing the one that will rule the nations with an iron scepter, the Psalm 2 moment. And yet this isn't exactly Bethlehem the way we know it.
Hmm.
Verse 3 introduces this dragon who's ready to eat the baby and is, sweet, has this force of deception, but also of violence. And I think the initial thing that it jars, I think the reader of Revelation into this moment going, hey, there's actually more happening behind the scenes of peaceful moments and of chaotic moments than what it is that we're actually paying attention to or giving credit for. And I think the churches of Asia Minor needed to hear that. And I think they needed to experience that in chapter 12 because if I know one thing about empires, they're really good at wrapping those that are inside of the empire in delusions. And part of Revelation's thinning the veil is to say, even in the moment that was the most tranquil, there was a war that was raging.
Hmm. Well, when I looked at your treatment of Revelation 12, which I think can be seen as, you know, a snapshot of the whole book in
Hmm.
many ways. Your emphasis on thinning the veil so that God speaks, communicates to us through Jesus Christ in a way that the veil is thinned or lifted or
Hmm.
whatever, and the church. And I think that image begins. It's a morphing image. Is begins with Mary. It
Hmm.
moves to Israel probably,
Hmm.
and it becomes the church. She becomes
Hmm.
the church. She flees, but the dragon is there, and the dragon is so important to the
Hmm.
theology of Revelation, and it's so important to Revelation 12 that in your crush scene in your own home, you've got a dragon.
Our nativity scene, man, I don't know if I wrote this in the book, but the first time I pulled that out, it was my wife and I hadn't even been married a full year yet. And Christmas comes and she gave me the opportunity to do the nativity scene, and I already had the dragon in my back pocket. I was ready. And we do every Christmas. It's kind of this almost ceremony, this family tradition where we
Yeah,
we have our nativity set up, but we always have a red dragon in the background,
yeah,
and to me that's essential for us even how we live day to day.
yeah.
It's a part of the problem that I wrestle with individually, but also collectively in the West, but also globally. It's so easy to forget that A, we're in a battle, and B, who the
Hmm.
enemy truly is.
Hmm.
And so that's Revelation 12 does us a major service
Yeah,
of pulling back the veil and allowing us to see who the true enemy is and therefore how to fight.
yeah. Well, I find your treatment very, very helpful. And there's all kinds of things that can be talked about in Revelation 12, but I find it to be a fundamental one.
Mm,
Um, as people, your audience reads this, how do you think this book can impact their life? Now, I
mm,
should say that you begin Revelation with a theme that I don't believe anybody begins with, anybody else. Um, but there was a moment, an existential moment for me in reading this,
mm,
is that John begins with loneliness.
mhm.
Um, how does that, how will this help people in their Christian life and in reading the book of Revelation to begin with that theme of loneliness?
Yeah. And we share this commitment when it comes to biblical study. But by God's grace, we're overhearing a conversation with about real people from real people that are going through real issues.
Mhm.
And I think I mean, we were even talking before we came on here about a book that you're currently working on with Paul. I don't want to disclose any details that you're not wanting to disclose, so I'll,
You can
okay.
go ahead.
But you were expressing, like, in Second Corinthians 10 through 13, is there evidence of Paul experiencing trauma or acting out of his trauma?
Yeah.
And I think what I love about that, and it's similar to what I was wrestling with this John on Patmos, is we forget to not just humanize who the book is written to, but the people writing the book.
Hmm.
I mean, John is as much as he is an inspired writer, he is also a pastor, and he is a son, and he is a husband, and a caretaker, and a minister, and a human. And if Christ experienced the spectrum of emotions that we see from Gethsemane and the tenderness that he has, the anger that he has at times, I don't think it's a ridiculous thing for us to inflesh the apostles or to inflesh the writers of the book. And in Revelation 1, John is on an island of Patmos alone, exiled, I mean, put there by the empire, intentionally displaced because of his testimony to Jesus. And so part of the approach of how I was coming with this, and this is how I wish all Bible study would begin and end, is empathy. And I know that word's taken a major hit in the last 6 months or so. I think, which I think is a satanic strategy.
I agree.
But but Philippians 2 is the ultimate move of empathy, where Jesus doesn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he enfleshes our experience. And I think that as studiers of the Bible, we ought to do the same. And so it just so happened when I was sitting down to write this, I myself was going through just deep bouts of loneliness and struggling with different things professionally that led me to feel more isolated. And I found that John would have been experiencing almost something similar. And that's why while fear is a powerful motivator for many of us, the entry point of loneliness to me is something that reminds me, A, not just that I'm reading about real people, but B, that my experiences today also resonate in the pages of the Bible, even Revelation.
Hmm.
And it was comforting for me too as I was wrestling finding in Mother Teresa's kind of biography from her diary. That she herself was 27 years feeling like she was isolated from Jesus. And so we all have a tendency to do this, to think that our experience is so unique that we can relate to no one. But I think that the saints of today and the saints of old tell us that actually the struggles are human, and there are answers to each of those human issues in Christ.
Yeah. Well, you've been to Patmos.
I have, yeah,
I tell my students, if you've been to Patmos, it's not a bad gig to get exiled on Patmos. But this is an important point that I think you draw out. Loneliness. This man loved these seven churches. Let's just say he's sort of a circuit rider, like a Methodist,
yeah,
and
right,
he's got kind of charge of the. I mean, he feels like he should be writing to these seven churches,
yeah,
and he loves them. He cares about them. He feels responsible for them.
mhm,
Um, if this is the Apostle John, it could be uh, connected to Mary.
yeah,
Mary's connected to Ephesus too,
right,
although that's a little on the edge. But um, this could give rise to apocalyptic desires for justice,
yeah,
is to see the empire cutting this man off from all the people he loves.
mhm,
And God gives to him these visions and he writes them out. And when he writes them out, I mean, we're all indebted to Richard Bauckham, aren't we?
right,
Yeah. Um,
absolutely,
when he writes them out, he cannot write without evoking one scripture after another without quoting
mhm,
anything.
right,
Uh, and it is, I mean, there's kind of quotes, but um, this is the way he writes. But I think it could be said that anybody placed in exile
Mm.
is having a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
And seeing this kind of apocalyptic, you used the word anger before, or
Hmm.
apocalyptic desire for God to bring justice and undo the injustices would be the sort of thing that a traumatized person would naturally express. And
Yeah.
going over the top into apocalyptic images, one after another, would be a good way to do it.
Right.
Uh, so,
But you do
um,
you see those traumatic undercurrents though too, where John explodes into where he's worshiping an angel multiple times, which would not be like a faithful follower of Jesus that walked him for 3 years. But when you're pushed to your breaking point, you're tempted to act outside of who you truly are. And that's one of the things I love about the scriptures is that our Old and New Testament, First and Second Testament, we do not ever edit out the let me just call them the vulnerable moments or the
yeah,
downfalls of the heroes. They're there because they're there in all of us.
warts and all.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, I mentioned Richard Bauckham,
Hmm.
but who are some of the New Testament scholars that have shaped or influenced you in reading Revelation, and who do you want students to read? If let's say
Hmm.
you get five.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that's great. My initial primary influence, he only wrote one book before he died, but was my mentor at Lincoln Christian University named Dr. Robert Lowry. He wrote a
Okay.
small little book for a publishing company that's actually local here in Joplin, called Revelations Rhapsody. And a lot of the way that he envisioned and wrestled with Revelation definitely shapes me significantly, even to this day. I'm literally, as I'm looking at my screen, but right above it, I have a picture of me and him hugging, right, like literally 2 months before he passed. Um, so, so a lot of the way I approach Revelation's influenced by him, and you can still get his book Revelations Rhapsody. It's still out there. Definitely Richard Bauckham. His little book, the Theology of Revelation. The only other book I've ever seen that packs as much significant, it covers as much significant ground in Revelation as Bockham's Revelation, Theology of Revelation, is Bruce Metzger's Breaking the Code.
That is a good book.
I cannot, 96 pages, and he
Yeah,
covers
yeah,
the whole book of
yeah.
Revelation.
I had both of my children read this book when they were in high school, and they became convinced preterists because of it. Well,
Preterist.
I don't know about my daughter. She loved Jerry Jenkins and Tim
No
Hay
kidding.
too. She read all those books.
Oh man, Bruce Metzger's though Breaking the Code
Yeah,
is
yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
Ian Paul's stuff that he has
yeah,
out, this
yeah.
Tyndale commentary series, I think is great. Definitely, I also mean it. But Revelation for the rest of us is,
Well,
you
thanks.
do a great job of pulling apart some of the. It reminded me a little bit of David Barr,
Mm,
where you start with kind of the playbill and you almost think of it as like this drama that's unfolding, which I think makes a lot of sense for the Christians that are closing their eyes in Ephesus and Smyrna and allowing the text of Revelation to be read over them and unfold like a drama. Um, so I think that's five. I mean, G.K. Beale, I would add, but these are the big five.
those are big. Those are big books too. David
Yeah.
Awney,
Yep.
um, his stuff is very significant, and there's great books on Revelation.
Yeah.
Um, what do you hope that Thinning the Veil, and I want to emphasize this book as thinning the veil so that we will see the impact of Jesus in our world.
Mhm.
Um, and God reveals Jesus to us. It's a revelation, of course. We can debate the genitive in Revelation 1:1. Um, what do you hope that this book will contribute to the study of Revelation?
Mhm. Yeah. There's actually several of those, so that was one of the things too, was I had a couple of things as a Revelation scholar that I wanted to make sure got said, but I didn't want to say it in a way where, the people in the pew wouldn't be able to wrestle with it as well. One of the things though I wanted to bring out to Revelation scholarship was Revelation interacts with the Old Testament in a way that I don't know that a lot of us biblical scholars are always comfortable with. Like we love to find our parallels, and then we love to, make sure we preserve the Old Testament context as it is being then, parallel to the New Testament. Revelation is just not as concerned with our methodology as we are.
Yeah,
It,
yeah,
it intentionally invokes, I mean, aspects of Daniel 7,
yeah,
but then it completely flips it. Or
yeah,
like I bring out in my chapter on Revelation 14, the winepress of God's fury from Isaiah 63 and Revelation 14 just seems to be completely turned on its head.
mhm,
I know Beale has done a lot of work in this, but I think sometimes we almost are more beholden to our historical grammatical methods than we are listening to how the New Testament author is allowing Christ to be their hermeneutic.
yeah,
And that's really what I was pushing hard for because I feel like that's what John was doing.
yeah.
When anything collides with Christ, in John's eyes, it's redefined.
Well,
Whether it's
like the temple.
exactly right, like
Everything,
Revelation
yeah.
yeah,
It's
11
it's
of
when
1
you're
through 2.
thinking, oh, this is happening because this was said in Daniel. You're going to get off. You're going to be disappointed.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah,
And in the New
yeah,
Testament does this as a whole, but I think
yeah.
Revelation does it in a way that, and you are right, and you bring this up in Revelation for the rest of us, is that, by my count, Revelation 404 verses, I have counted over 516 allusions to the Old Testament. So it is dripping with illusions, but it's more like how Matthew interprets Isaiah 7. Like it's a different way of allowing
Yeah,
Christ to be the goal of everything that has been written.
yeah.
So for Revelation scholarship, I'd like for us to wrestle with that more. And I also think I would say I really tried to bring the world of Rome more alive. We do a lot of parallelisms. I love David Downey's stuff. I think it's great. But sometimes I'm afraid we're gathering parallels, but we're not asking okay, but why is this parallel significant?
Hmm.
And so like with the release of Satan, the Roman
Yeah, that
triumphal
was
procession.
very informative.
Yeah,
I'd never considered that.
yeah,
That's a
and
good suggestion.
I do. I wonder if we allow ourselves to be immersed in the imagery of Rome. So, like with
Hmm.
Revelation 17, I was trying to make the argument that it was the foundational myth of Rome,
Hmm.
Remus and Romulus being riffed on with the imagery of the prostitute for, that Latin word for she-wolf, which is central to the Roman myth, but it can also mean prostitute. And I think that's intentional. I think John is doing that. So I would like to see more Revelation scholarship, not just make parallels to Rome imagery, but to actually explain how it intersects with the people that would have been subjects of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think you're right that anything that collides with Christ, any any idea
Mhm.
in the Roman world or in the Jewish world that collides with Christ is going to come out looking different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I would even, and I know that, I mean, your book makes this point very clear, and that should be the same for today.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I hope we can reflect on more is like I think in one of the chapters I talk about Revelation 4 and 5, like, Christ redefines every term that matters to us, monotheism, but even words like power,
Hmm.
like we're going to have to understand that power is not defined the same post cross. It just isn't. And
Hmm.
victory isn't. And suffering isn't. And death isn't. And this is the good news. Like, this is the good
Hmm.
news.
Well, Shane, I think that this is an incredible segue for us.
Hmm.
Um, I believe that the evangelical church's obsession with I'm just going to call it dispensational schemes,
Uh-huh.
not dispensationalism, because I have friends like Daryl Bach that I don't think treat
Hmm.
things like this at all,
Yeah.
but has prevented the evangelical church from recognizing the theopolitical message of this book.
Yeah.
And just what you said there, it redefines power. It redefines monotheism. It redefines discipleship. Redefines obedience. All these things now take on a completely different perspective
Yeah.
because of the thinning of the veil,
Hmm.
as you talk about it. And that's where I think the Book of Revelation has been failed by
Hmm.
evangelical preachers and teachers, because we are now living in a world in which many evangelicals cannot recognize the idolatrous and worse understanding of Christian nationalism
Hmm.
that surrounds the president and is a big issue.
Hmm.
And to me, those who like us read Revelation, we're looking, this shouldn't be happening.
Sure.
Because we shouldn't be idolizing anyone this way. As you know from my book, Revelation for the Rest of Us, our angle was to it was to present the theopolitical message
Hmm.
of this book
Hmm.
by beginning with Revelation 17 and 18 and seeing the marks of empire, or the marks of Babylon,
Hmm.
in the book of Revelation as a template for us to have a hermeneutic to evaluate the righteousness or injustices of political powers.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where I think what Revelation does, and I think all apocalyptic literature, but especially Revelation, is it says, I think it's saying two things simultaneously, and I think that almost we can almost hear them as antithetical, but I think in the revelation of Jesus Christ it makes sense. Number one, it says, no, your hope should never be in an earthly government. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's not where your hope is. They're so transient. It's the reason why in Revelation Rome is referred to as Babylon. Like we've
Mm-hmm.
seen this before. This is a
Yes.
very normal cycle from Babylon to Egypt to Greece to Rome. That is not where our hope is. And that's one of the things that that I want us to wrestle with as Christ followers is every election cycle should not send us into this frenzy as if everything that we have worked towards is at stake. Because ultimately, what we're experiencing in those cycles is far too small for our hope to fit into. However, I will also say, on the opposite side, tearing down governments is too small of a target for Revelation. That's one of the things I argue in the chapter on 12 through 14 is Rome may be collateral damage, but the target is the dragon and the two beasts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
because Rome's gonna fall,
Yeah.
that's just assured. But Rome falling doesn't actually impact Satan and his kingdom unless those enemies are converted into Christ followers, into friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I do. I think that those two theological poles from any government in any location have traditionally confused Christians, and I think it's definitely something here in the American West that we do need to wrestle with and ask the question: where is our hope, or where is our goal? Because it's just when we're engaging the dragon, all of the weapons and all of the ways we engage it are just vastly different. And Jesus revealed this to us on the cross.
Yes. Shane, we've got a question that's come in.
Okay.
This is one that I get asked.
Okay.
So I want to hear your answer. How can we share this amazing book, and they're talking about your book,
Hmm.
without offending those who wholeheartedly believe the rapture and draw dividing lines?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big one. So first of all, I usually always try to preface it by saying, I always tell my students this all the time. Like, listen, you're allowed to disagree with me and get an A. Like there's no there's nothing at stake here with you not agreeing with me. However, I want us to disagree respectfully and for you to tell me why. Like I have an opportunity to learn just as much as the next person. However,
Mm-hmm.
I'm also very cognizant of the fact that whenever I'm speaking to somebody about rapture, I'm not just talking to them about an idea. It's usually an idea attached to a person that means something to them. So more often than not, whenever I talk to somebody about the rapture and they're very passionate about it, it's connected to the grandma that took them under their wings when their parents were strung out on drugs, and she took them to church, and she
Mm-hmm.
believed in the rapture. And you're telling me that my grandma that is now dead is wrong? And that's whenever I realize the same thing I would argue for when we're studying the Bible. These are real people. Is the same thing I would argue whenever people are coming to me asking questions about the rapture. So the first thing I encourage students is be patient. Allow people to wrestle with the questions. Allow them to, you don't have to solve the tension, and especially don't think you can accomplish it in a conversation. Ask the questions. The second thing I would do, though, is to keep emphasizing. We all can agree. All can agree that drawing closer to Jesus is the purpose of the Bible. And that's where
Hmm.
I'm going. We got to keep coming back to this. Like, even if we're going to get, at times caught up in the debates, that I'm not saying that they don't matter, but I am saying ultimately, if you can continue to bring it back to how does this draw you closer to Jesus, sometimes emphasizing that trajectory starts to erode some of the rapture theology indirectly. But
Hmm.
it's just, it's not as complicated, or it's more complicated than believing if you have the right data and can make the right argument, then you can win your church over. My response would be how you do this is just as important as what you're doing. And so don't even be worried if the person walks away and goes, "I still think you're wrong." Okay, that's all right.
When I first started teaching, I was teaching at Trinity. Um, I became convinced of, you probably know of R.T. France's A
Hmm.
View of Matthew 24.
Yep.
Okay, along and Tom Wright. It all comes from G.B. Caird.
Hmm.
Okay, so um, I would teach this in class. And, when rapture stuff came up, I'd say, well, if you want to categorize me, I'm probably post-trib, but we don't need to go there.
Sure.
But I would talk to pastors 5 years after they'd been pastoring, and they would tell me they can't talk about the book of Revelation without the threat of being fired
Yeah.
because everybody is so dispensational in their audiences.
Hmm.
What I have found to be perhaps a wedge issue that can actually pierce into other people's views is to recognize the significance that this book was written about Rome.
Yeah.
And if you can go to 17 and 18 and say, now this is Rome,
Hmm.
it's not even very good poetry
Hmm.
to, to say it's Seven Hills and you don't know who that is. You're not trying to disguise much. All right. So, and you've got a nice little map of the Seven Hills.
Yeah.
Um, the When they realized it was written about Rome in the first century,
Hmm.
it kind of deflates some of the pressure
Hmm.
to wonder if this is the Antichrist is Putin or
Yeah.
Netanyahu
Right.
or Trump. I don't know who they
Sure.
might think it might be.
Yeah.
And that's often what I find is getting it back to the first century has a
Hmm.
capacity to change the entire dynamic.
Absolutely. No, I find that too, and that's one of the things that you do this. I think it's in like chapter 2 or 3 in Revelation for the rest of us. But bringing in that historical background, and
Yeah,
and that's a sterile way of saying what I usually say, and that's this is written to real people at a real time going through real issues, and they needed
yeah,
a real word from their pastor.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and John
yeah,
is a and this is the other thing I would add to that is and John's a good pastor. He wasn't speaking past them. He was speaking to them.
yeah,
So if he says in Revelation and it doesn't make its way until the rapture 2000 some odd years later, that's a bad pastor.
yeah. Well, one of the concerns is these people want to say we got to have something that people can latch onto. And I've often said the genius of the dispensational method is that it gives you the picture. This is what's
Yep.
happening.
Yep.
And it's easy to see. And that kind of dynamic. Now, one of the reasons it's easy to see is because they predict this is what's going to happen,
Right.
this is going to happen. And so now they've got a timeline.
Hmm.
Those who don't think this is a timeline have a little bit more, ideological uh, interpretation. They think, well, this is more of a political thrust, or this is more about our capacity to follow and see who Jesus is for us today.
Hmm.
But we need more and more books like yours
Hmm.
in order to convince more people, that some of these readings need to be changed. But man, uh,
Yeah.
uh, and someone has asked, why don't more scholarly interpretations of Revelation have compelling helpful graphics
Hmm.
summarizing better understandings of the book. You know when I read this one,
Is
you,
that?
you know who Larkin is, don't you?
Oh yeah, I do.
I mean, those were, I had one of those. I had one of those charts, and they
Those
are
are
so big.
enormous. Yeah.
They take almost a whole shelf of your books. If you put it on top of the other books, it's so long.
Yeah.
It was at least 24 inches long.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, easily. Yeah.
and they were brilliant, in what
Yeah.
they were trying to do. But we do need more graphic images
Mhm.
to give people something that they can visualize.
Yep.
And I think you have some nice pictures in your book. So
Yeah, and some of the and so to kind of even answer that question, it's like, but what graphics we're putting out there is it matters just as much as whether or not that they are, compelling or helpful. I mean, what I mean by that is like some of the images that I put in the book are images that the first century churches would have actually seen. They would have
hmm.
seen these coins. They would have seen this
Yes,
image
yes,
of the she wolf suckling Remus and Romulus. So um, and I would say that it's also though comparable to saying why aren't there better charts on Monet or on Van Gogh or on Picasso? And it's like because but the art itself is
yeah,
actually what is the most compelling. And so the
yes,
picture of Jesus that I think that comes out in Revelation is really the greatest graphic that we could actually paint.
yeah. Okay, here's a question. This is a good one. I
Hmm.
hope you can answer it because I can't. What are some of the best questions to ask of a dispensationalist? Ask of
Mhm.
dispensationalists if you are coming at it from an amillennialist perspective.
Hmm. Yeah, a lot of the
Yeah,
times, which
they
I'm
say, they continue. How do you respond to a dispensationalist who accuses you of not believing what the
mhm.
Bible says, or even being anti-Semitic if you don't take their theological view? Yeah, there you go.
It gets pretty, yeah, it can get
It
really
go,
wild really quick.
yes,
And
yeah,
it does. I mean, at its very core, and I'm sure that you agree with this on some level. I mean, while I have sympathies towards amillennialism, I'm not summarized by that position. Like I
yeah.
have issues even with some of the contours and conclusions that are traditional to that position as well. But it comes down to methodology. It comes down to assumptions. It comes down to, I mean, for example, the question they had there about accusing of not believing what the Bible says. Well, that's kind of this literal figurative debate. And it's
Yes,
like
it is. Yeah,
the problem is that language doesn't fit in those boxes as neatly and tightly as we want them to.
good point.
Even what I just did right there was a literal way of saying something through a figurative language. Like
Yeah.
it's not as clear cut. And a lot of the times you're going to. So, for example, what did dispensationalists do with chapters 2 and 3? They turned them into time periods, which is a very figurative way of reading seven literal churches. At a certain point, we both have to admit we are not. One of us is not coming from a literal perspective, and the other a figurative. We're both weaving those together to bring about what our assumptions bring us to, and that is assumptions usually are connected to questions. So the questions that dispensationalists usually come to Revelation with is, when is the rapture going to happen? Or when
Mhm.
will the world end? That's not the questions that I think that Revelation asks me to come with or that I come with. It's, who is Jesus? How do I draw closer to him in a world that seems to be burning down? The anti-Semitism thing is just because that's the whole, the nation of Israel is God's chosen people. This is the one thing I usually always go back to and say, listen,
1948,
that's right.
1948.
That's right. The establishment of the
It's
nation.
almost 80 years now, folks. That's a long generation.
That's right. I always though say like, listen, I understand your heart for Israel. I mean, my goodness, their story birthed our Messiah. So I'm very pro Jesus, and I have no interest, and I believe the gospel leaves no room for racism or anti-Semitism. So nothing am I saying goes against that. However, I will say this: everyone needs Jesus. Everyone. I don't care who you were born to. I don't care your ethnicity. Everyone needs Jesus, even Jews. And that
Yeah.
was the message of the early church.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's not this replacement theology or anything. It's that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets.
Yeah.
He is what the Old Testament was pointing to, and that should be always close to our tongue, no matter what we're talking about.
Shane, how would you've done this.
Hmm.
I've never done this. I've preached a couple sermons on Revelation.
Hmm.
I liked preaching on it, but how would you construct a series on Revelation
Hmm.
in a church that probably most of the people have the instincts of dispensationalism,
Hmm.
and probably a lot of other people have the instincts that this is a scary book. Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
How would now is this is this your book?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
series?
right.
Was this the sermons?
It was not. It was not
Yeah.
the sermons.
Okay.
It was fresh, but they could be. You could. There's several ways of doing it. I was actually zooming with the church just last week, wanting to preach through Revelation, and the first question I always asked was because they wanted to go, scene one, they loved Revelation one like I had in the book, and then they're like sermon two, we want to go right after the rapture, and I was like, listen, you can do that. That's fine. I said, you know your people better than me. I said, but you also have some of the most beautifully rich pictures of Jesus throughout this book. Why don't you write a whole sermon series around the pictures of Jesus in Revelation? Or like I did in this book, is focusing on these human themes of loneliness and intimacy and identity, and this is there too. So there's a multitude of ways of doing it. I would strongly encourage people not just to preach from chapters 2 and 3 and ignore the rest of the book,
That's
but I
pretty
also
common.
understand that.
Yeah, I think John Stott probably did that
Sure.
of what Christ thinks of the church.
Yeah.
Um, what would be the best way to use thinning the veil as a discipleship course in a church?
Huh. Yeah, that's a great question, and that's really my heart, which is why the end of every chapter, I have this what I call going deeper, where I give them a tool, a text, and a takeaway. And the tool and the text, they each have actual 15 to 20-minute videos that I recorded where actually there's this cool little feature where it's like I'm actually writing on the screen of the viewer. But there's where they can sit down in small groups and they can learn the tools, so like context and historical background. And then the text, where I kind of go through the text in a different way than I do in the writing. But then the third way, the takeaway to me is the most important because I think this is the way Bible study always should go. Is it's a spiritual discipline of some sort. So I believe the first one is Lectio Divina, which is an ancient way of Christians reading the scriptures as a way of interacting with the Spirit of God. And so if you do it with giving people this tool, this text and this takeaway, it can actually start to bring revelation alive where they can encounter Christ.
Hmm. Very helpful. Very helpful. All right. Someone asks a theoretical question. Do you think that Revelation is seen more as a source of hope to persecuted Christians and a source of fear for Christians who aren't experiencing persecution?
Mm.
If so, why is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, and Scott, I'll be interested to hear your answer to this as well. I will say it is a lot easier to sell the idea of a future rapture in a place that doesn't experience physical persecution than it is to sell in the underground church of China.
Mhm.
I mean, this idea that before things get bad, we'll get taken out, or I guess if you're post-trib, then that doesn't count. But it is. I do think. I think Revelation though is a challenge to both. I think it's those that are suffering Christians are challenged to continue to see with the eyes of Christ and the cross. Those that are compromising or avoiding or are not in a context of physical persecution, it's for those to actually stay vigilant because you can still be lulled to sleep on a battlefield, which is just as dangerous as walking off it.
Um, I think I would go first to the original audience of the seven churches
Hmm.
who were being given a vision of what was really going on in the world, in spite of the fact, because the veil was
Yeah.
thinned, they were able to see what's actually going on and not be mesmerized by the power of Rome and the threats of Rome against the church. One of my favorite themes in Revelation, which I think I first saw in Richard Bauckham, didn't
Hmm.
we all see themes in Bauckham, is to think of how small the churches were in those seven churches.
Hmm.
And, you know, maybe 20, maybe 50. I mean, how many Christians are in Sardis?
Right.
We don't know. Um, but the vision of the book of Revelation is that the number of believers is innumerable.
Yeah.
It is so vast from every tribe and tongue and language, all over the world, that they're given a vision that, in spite of what you're seeing now, that is not the final word.
Yeah.
The final word will be justice in the world through the peace of the Messiah. And this Messiah brought this peace through the bloodstained garment, you know.
Hmm.
So this victory is not conquer Rome with a better army,
Hmm.
but conquer Rome with a different kind of battle.
That's exactly right.
And
Yeah.
so I would say that I don't think the book was designed to create fear.
Yeah. Me
I
neither.
think the book was designed to comfort believers, even though it can be a bit weird. And I believe that as the judgments, whatever you want to call them,
Hmm.
I like to call them disciplines, in in the middle of the book of Revelation, they're interrupted with scenes of worship
Yep.
as forms of subversion of how to cope with all this uh, threatening, looming destruction that can come. They
Yeah.
know that God is in control and that this God will win
Yep.
with justice.
Hmm. Absolutely. No, I agree with you. The book was not intended to incite fear,
Yeah.
but courage and confidence and strength in Christ. No, that's great.
Okay, the last question is,
Mm.
you brought this up. Is the point of bringing it back to Rome to increase the visibility of the eternal struggle of the spiritual realms, or to help counteract the prediction emphasis?
If and if they what they mean by that is me bringing it back to Rome.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
I want them to taste the book. Like I always try to remind my students, every New Testament book, by God's grace, we're overhearing a conversation between a pastor and his people. So bringing it back to Rome is to taste it from the first century perspective.
Yeah.
But it does move to an eternal perspective because you
Hmm.
realize they're human like you and they
Hmm.
have struggles just like you, and Christ has overcome. Christ's conquering isn't relegated to a time period. It is eternal. But there will be multiple Romes, and that even in of itself is a part of the revelation of Christ.
Yeah.
But okay,
Well,
so
thanks, Shane.
I'm seeing that we're at the end. So let's see. I'm sorry. I gotta make sure I. Okay, yeah. So I do want to first of all thank everybody that participated in the launch team and that's been here. Huge thanks to Scott and for taking the time out. Also, if you guys want to not just keep up with what's happening with this book, but keep up with Scott's stuff, there is a going to be a link in the chat to Scott's Substack so that you can keep up with what he's been doing, which has shaped me in multiple ways. Especially one of my favorite Scot McKnight books is A Community Called Atonement. That actually met me at a wonderful. That was a balm to my soul during a time in which I was, in some sense, feeling very conflicted on my own atonement journey. And so that's one of my favorites. But my
Well,
goodness,
thanks.
keep up with everything else Scott's doing. And yeah, we have what, 5 days till the launch. So thank you all very
That's
much for
cool.
joining.
Well, thank you, Shane, for such an excellent book, and may the Lord bless it.